So up next we have Stephen Myers. He is going to be talking to us today about Angular 2 and giving us just a quick overview of the framework and some of the stuff in it. So thanks, Stephen.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So first things first, there's kind of a naming convention. Angular.js refers to Angular versions 1.x, and Angular refers to versions 2 onwards because the versioning they're doing right now, it's quite a bit quicker. So you're going to be at Angular version 5 here in a little bit. And we'll start off here. So one of the things about Angular is you basically have two viable languages you can use. One is Dart, which no one outside Google uses. The other is TypeScript. And TypeScript, you can pretty much write it as normal JavaScript, but the one thing you are going to run into are decorators, right? That might throw people for a loop. It's really not that bad. You can see here's an example. So this is a basic component, right? It has the component decorator, which applies the metadata, which is that JSON object, is the argument, applies it to the class, right? So, you know, it just gives a selection and stuff like that. It's really pretty straightforward. But the cool thing about Angular components I like, well, one of the cool things about them is that the styles, they're scoped right from the get-go, right? And you'll find a lot of the React community, well, a lot of the talk here is about, they're always talking about CSS and JS. How do we do this? How do we do this? You don't even have to worry about it. Don't even think about it. You have a native well, they have shimming by default, but you can also put it into the shadow DOM for browsers that support it, which is most modern browsers, just nothing like IE, which is not even a browser. So we'll not worry about that. Oh, and then there's a couple things. They're very similar to like an Angular.js component, but there are a couple differences. Like you don't have this namespacing. Right there, if this was an Angular 1.5 component, for example, you'd have to do $controller. And the other cool thing about components is if you do upgrade your Angular 1 application, you can kind of throw them into the upgrade package and use them almost interchangeably. You can actually upgrade an Angular 1 component to use it in an Angular 2 app, or vice versa. You can downgrade. So they're pretty cool. And then we're just going to go over a little bit of the templating stuff, just because we'll come through some code, and I just want people to understand kind of what's going on. So when you have your component, here's their example. The square brackets, that's a property going in, and the circular brackets, that is basically registering an event listener, more or less, right? So the first thing is the parent, and the second one is the actual component. Now, the one thing that's kind of confused, well, threw me for a little bit of a loop, is so the output, you see that there's a decorator again, at output update equals new event emitter. That doesn't actually really, it's not an event emitter. Like it's not going to emit like some type of custom event that's going to bubble or propagate through your DOM. It's just it's basically an RxJS subject, so you subscribe to that thing. So if you don't subscribe to it in your parent component, don't expect it to pop up later on unless you do some trickery. So directives. Most people think about directives, they think basically are like Angular 2 components now, right? But there's structural directives, which have that star prefix, and those will make changes to the DOM, and that will be stuff like your ng4, which is like the Angular.js is like ng repeat, ngif, so forth, right? Those are basically templates, so they're not so that is like imagine there's a template element wrapped around outside that, and it's basically saying repeat this template X amount of times, right? So that's something that's kind of useful to know for later on. And then you have like an attribute directive like the highlight, and you can imagine that it's like turns the color yellow or something like that on mouse enter or something, right? And then so now you have pipes, right? So pipe is this little operator here, and they're pretty useful. By far the most useful, and like actually a very cool feature, I love this about Angular, is the async pipe. So the async pipe will resolve a promise, or it'll manage an observable. Observables are kind of like, if you haven't really heard about them, imagine it's like a stream of events, okay? So like, it'll subscribe to it, it'll like change the values as they change over time, or if it's a promise, it'll resolve the promise, which is nice because a lot of time in your code, you have this boilerplate, which is like get promise at the beginning, resolve it, turn this state variable into this, okay, now it's state variables in here, and here you just pass it right to your template, it manages everything else. The other thing that's interesting about this example is you have the else loading thing. Now, if you notice the loading down here, that's a template. And well, it's an NG template, but really it's just a template. And you can see how the star there, how I was saying that's a template, how it interacts with other templates. You can swap them, right? They're interchangeable. They're both templates. So it may not seem to be a big deal to have if-else logic, but to an Angular developer, it's amazing. That was actually like an Angular 4 feature. They were quite proud of that. Okay, so now we got a little bit over that. Now I'm going to try and do just a couple kind of, well, actually, this next one. First thing we're going to do is we're just going to show you that, yeah, there's still template-driven forms. We're going to talk about forms right now. So it's template-driven forms. This is very much like an AngularJS form, right? You have your ng model. You have, your validations in here. You got submit. You got this form variable. It's like in your template or something. Who knows where it is, right? And it's just whatever. I'll just type some stuff in here. Oh, this has to be a number, right? So it's just like that. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but where is that form? What is that thing? Is it a data structure? Is it this? I don't know. It lives in the template. So one thing they have now is they have reactive forms, okay? So here, we'll just look at the template here. And the thing to notice is you have this form group. You're passing in a property, as we shown earlier, and it's called my form, right? It's a little bit of style changes when it becomes valid and whatnot. And then you have these form control names. So if you look further down, if this is our component, we have our form, which is our form group. It's a data structure. It has properties, name and age. You can access these things. You can touch them. They're real things. You can pass them around. They're not. So that's what the difference between like the template-driven form, where it exists only in your template, versus a form group, which what they call reactive forms, which exist. Well, they're data structures, right? And you have validators you can pass in. And this is the one thing I'm thinking that Angular does. I'm not sure if other people do. Is you have this concept called async validation. Well, I mean, it's not really a concept, but that's what's called async validator. And it will run when your synchronous validation is valid, right? So that's what it does. And I think, like, I have a hard time figuring out exactly what is async validation, but sending requests to the server and getting your response back, right? So really, you have this structure that wraps up your network request and everything in it all in one piece. So you don't have to write this other function on submit. Okay, here's my controller. I'm actually managing the form. I'm not actually managing like my UI. It provides a nice separation of concerns. So here, we're basically, we have our count, we have this, right? So we saw that. And actually, here's what I want to look at. And we're just going to count how many times the async validator runs, right? Now, we put it in. Okay, so it hasn't run at all because the synchronous validation isn't complete, right?
So what is the synchronous validation?
The synchronous validation, right? Maybe I glossed over that. In here, it's kind of hidden in here because, so the name is required, the age, composed the pattern, so it's a number, and it's required. So it's the same thing as the other one, right? So those things have to be valid, and then your process will run, because you don't want a asynchronous request firing every time you put input in, which may not be what your server is expecting, right? So as you can see, we have John and we have 2, and then 3. Okay, it's valid. So that's one thing Angular does, and I think you can kind of take this a little bit further. Right, is if you so imagine if you had this, like another example. We have 2 inputs. We have color, and we have, what's the other one? Brand, I think. Yes, obviously, brand Ford. Okay, so boom. So it runs, right? So that right there, it took our input. It said, okay, the validate, I'll show you the code in a bit, but I'll just run over what it did right there. Takes the input, it says, okay, this is valid, I'm sending a network request, right? And then we get the content back off that, which any framework can do. It's not like this is like magic, like this is just the same thing. But again, what Angular does here is you have all that logic is contained within this one structure, right? So if you have a service here, you have a form service, right? And this is where you construct that. You got your color and your brand. And you got your validator here. This is your synchronous validation. No empty fields. Right? That's all it is. So that's not really the exciting part. But just so everyone knows, there's no magic, nothing like that. The one thing that's kind of, you do have this. This is where it's going to fire off what we get back from our server, right? So here's the async validation. Now, remember before there was a promise, right? Okay, so here's an observable. This is the big thing about Angular. Angular is very, very, very heavily intertwined with observables, right? There's so it's RxJS. It's everywhere. You don't have to use it, but you can use it, right? So here's your asynchronous validation, which is sending your network request when your input's valid, and you bring up your form value. You make your request, merge map. You can think of this as resolving the promise, right? That's all it really is. You can't, so it takes the promise, resolves it, passes the resolved value to content, which we shoot off. And then here at the end, this is, so asynchronous validator is going to have to return an object with the errors or null, right? So if there's something there, it's good. If there's nothing there, we're going to make a fake error saying empty response. Now, you don't have to get the whole on the code, but the main idea about this is that you have your, right here, you have a data structure that's going to take your input, and it's also going to handle your network requests and shooting out the content all in one place, right? It's not in some controller with a service over here, you're calling this, you got a state variable over this, it's all self-contained, right? And you can pass this around. So what we'll do, this top stuff, I just kept it there to show if someone wants to look at the code, but it's really just some options we can choose. So this is our form group right here that we just talked about. We grabbed this form, this is in our component, and that is this, right? So that's this. We're pulling in our form group. And so now we don't have to have any of that network code, any of that stuff in here, right? We just have our form group, the brand. So this is the one thing, another thing about this form group is we can tap into it because it's a data structure, right? We can say, okay, so we can say when value for the brand changes. If you're going to do this in another framework, like I'm sure you could do it, but you'd have to write some type of on-change handler that maybe calls another function or something like that. Here, we just pull into it, right? And that is the one that just generates our autofill, right? And then the content, that's what fires right here. And so then here's our template, and we have our form group we pass in, form control name, that's color. We have brand, and we have our autocomplete, right? And then we have our results. So I guess the point I'm trying to get across is that you have these three very separate things, right? You have your template, which doesn't know about the network requests. You have your controller, which only knows about how to hook up the UI, and then you have your form group, which controls the input and handles all logic. Now, I'm not sure if this is like an accepted pattern. This is something I kind of just like played with, but I thought it was good to highlight something that I think Angular does, which as far as I know of, no other framework really provides, right? So I'm not saying go out there and do it, but as far as I can tell, I mean, what's asynchronous validation besides sending requests and getting it back? I mean, you wouldn't just send something back and then not use it. It'd be silly. Okay. Now we'll talk about. Okay. Now we'll talk about the routers, right? Again, this is going to be something on observables, right? Because Angular has lots of observables, so it's really important to kind of, if you're going to talk about Angular, you can't really talk about Angular without having observables, right? So we'll have a little example. This time I'm going to try and talk about the code first instead of the demo. And so you have this component, okay? Now it's going to have a color, which is going to give an observable a string, and it's going to come from here, which is the route. The activated route, the current route. Now you have your query parameters. This is what it provides, observable interface. Like I was saying, Angular provides observable interfaces into pretty much everything. You're going to take out the color parameter, or it's going to be inherit, and you're going to count how many times you do this. Now that color observable is going to pass through an async pipe. Well, here first, these are just the links. The interesting thing about Angular 2 is you have router link active, which you can use to style the active link. Now, you're going to have, if you notice, you have 3 of these, because ng4, 3 of these, and you're going to have 1, 2. So you have 5 in total, 5 subscriptions. And you'll notice that this is executed 5 times, right? But it's just that one piece of code. Imagine if this was a network request or some type of, you're going to local storage, you're running some type of expensive operation. You're running it 5 times when you just want to run it once. And this is the problem called cold and hot observables. And it can be a frustrating thing. And to highlight the example, like we'll just click, like now we can execute it 10 times. It's 1 line of code. We're just trying to get that color, right? So what you do is you're either going to, so you notice now, so this is the same thing, but we've only executed 3 times. So as you can see, it's like, divided by 5, we have the actual answer that we want. We want 3. So what you could do is you either share the observable, and this is like something that a lot of people don't do. So you want to share the observable, which will make it, which will now, when everything subscribes to it, this thing has already been executed. So you don't have to re-execute the same code. Or you resolve it once and you pass it through. So the idea with this is to show how Angular provides observable interfaces into like the activated route, multiple things, and how to deal with observables using the async pipe, and how to manage your subscriptions, which are important. Okay. And oh damn it, I forgot this one thing. Okay, I'm gonna have to reload it for 1 second. So another cool thing about since we're on the oh, thought that was supposed to be hidden. Sorry, people. Okay. Now, a cool thing about Angular Router is that you can do a lazy loading very easily. As you see, you got a network request in here that this original component was not part of the original application. And that code there, when you describe your in your router config, that's all you have to do. You just give it a relative route to, or no, well, I guess that'd be absolute. You give it a route to the module you're talking about, little hashtag, and then the module name, and then the compiler will actually generate a separate bundle for you. If you want to do this in other stuff, I mean, you're gonna have to mess around with Webpack, and it's not impossible, but it's gonna be a little bit trickier. So that's very nice for the router. Makes it very straightforward, and it kind of segues a little bit into our next talk, or our next part. Talk about the tooling. So Angular has a very nice CLI, and this is one of the things that allows for this, like building those lazily loaded routes relatively easily. Is you don't even have to think about it because you hand it to this, and then when you I didn't include all the commands, but you'll do something like ng build -- prod. And it will take care of all that stuff, minify all your code, do all that type of stuff. You have component generation. It'll generate your tests for you. It'll do all that for you. So it's very, very handy. They say it's not good for creating consumable libraries. You can look there if you want. I'm not totally convinced on that, but that's another debate for another time. And then finally, we'll show Angular language services. So if you notice here, you're getting auto-completion or IntelliSense on components within your application. It'll highlight when you're getting errors, and it'll see when it comes to user, that's a property in the component. It'll show you use async pipe and stuff like this. So this type of stuff you don't like AngularJS, you don't get this. I don't know if you get this in other languages, but I highly doubt it. And it's honestly, I don't even think it's auto magic, because you just download the package, npm package, and it runs in VS Code, it runs in WebStorm, and it's I'm very happy with it. And that is everything. Did anyone have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could go back to the hospital observable part.
Oh, yeah.
A bit more about why it was executing so much more without the share and what the share actually does.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to repeat his question.
Sure. He wanted to go back to the hot versus cold observables and talk a little bit more about why you're getting more executions than you would normally expect. And yeah, this can be this is pretty confusing. And I've seen, this is why it's, tried to go over it, but I should go in depth a little bit more. So you have this, right? This is your observable that you're subscribing to in your template, right? Now, this is what's called a cold observable. So any subscription to this is going to cause an execution of the entire chain. And if you want a little bit more example or explanation of what a cold hot observable is, you should probably click that link, because Ben Lesh, he's like on the Exchange.js team, he's very smart and knows what he's talking about. But why is it executing 5 times when it should be executing once? This is the reason why. You have in here, see this async pipe? This subscribes to the observable, and you have 3 of them here, because that's for choice of colors. And I'll show you maybe in here. So this might be. So you have 3 in here, and then you also have 1 here and 1 here. So you have 5 in total. So those subscriptions aren't shared. They're all going to be one pipeline, so forth until you get 5. So when you click it here, now you're getting 10. You're getting 15, and if you had network requests, you're just spamming the crap out of your server. And so what you can do then is you either use this share operator, and there's multiple operators. Like there's so many operators in here. There's gonna be share, there's share replay, there's publish, etc. And basically, what lots of these things do is they just they'll take it into a subject, what's called a subject, and it'll multicast it. So then anything that connects to that will get this value that's loaded into here. And the other thing you can do, if you don't want to do that, which you might not want to do, is you can in the template you can subscribe to it and then assign it to a variable inside the template, and then reference that variable instead of passing through the async pipe. So one thing you have to make sure is that if you're gonna pass the same thing through multiple pipes, if you're gonna subscribe to it multiple times, you have to watch about your execution, like how it's going to execute. And the other thing I didn't really cover is that a lot of people will, because they're so used to using the async pipe, which will dispose of an observable, is if they manually subscribe to it, they don't unsubscribe, and you have to manually unsubscribe at some point. So.
Just to quickly add, I know the best description I've seen that describes the difference between a hot and cold observable is like, so if you have a hot observable, when you subscribe to it, you're not going to make whatever is producing sort of like the events almost. So if you have like a mouse click or something like that, when you subscribe to it, it doesn't create like the button element or whatever you're clicking or you're watching for events on. It won't create that. It just adds a listener to it. Whereas when it's a cold one, it could be something like set timeout. And so when you subscribe, it starts a new timer, sets a new set timeout every time someone subscribes. So basically, when you do a cold one, it goes and it creates a new producer basically that will produce a new value. So you could have like a bunch of timers running or something like that. Whereas when it's hot, it wouldn't do that. It would have like you can see that the producer already exists. Maybe you're just adding a listener to it or something. So it's kind of confusing terminology, but the real difference is when you subscribe, are you like making a new object or is it one you use?
Yeah, I prefer unicast to multicast myself, but and then that's the other thing about so this right here, this is hot, right? But then when you subscribe to it, it just starts turning cold because this is because you could have multiple subscriptions. Even in here, in this code here, I have this is subscribing to that query param. This is subscribing to it. This thing is subscribing to it. They're all subscribing to it, but they're all getting that same event. It's not creating a new thing, right? But yeah, it's definitely like, I guess the main point about it is when you're using Angular and you're dealing with observables, they do have a learning curve, and you're going to have to watch how you manage these things, because if you're not careful about it, you'll execute your code way too many times. Or if you're not unsubscribing properly, you'll have these subscriptions that are just closures that are just hanging out throughout your entire application, constantly running, and you won't know about it unless you're observing it somehow. I don't know. You know.
So,
Oh, sorry.
actually one question. What is the name of the IntelliSense plugin? Who is the author? Like you mentioned that IntelliSense plugin.
Oh, the plugin. That is so that's Angular language services. And that will just be, I'm pretty sure that's just an npm package, I think. Yeah. So it's maintained by the Angular team, and if you use the CLI, which I would recommend, I think it's almost like I've read people say it's the best practice, right? Is that then when as soon as you start up an app, it'll come with it, and it just works. Like,
So, like, is there any such plugin which is maintained or developed by organizations like Microsoft or things like that?
So it was developed by the Angular team, which is Google, and if you look at some of the code, you'll actually see copyright from Microsoft as well. So it's an open source project that has some type of joint operation between them. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Why don't we wrap it up there, maybe? Are
Yeah.
you going to come for drinks after?
No, I'm probably going home.
Okay. Or if people want to get in touch with you with questions, what's the best way to do that?
Just tweet me. SLMyers11. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks.
Exchange.js is Edmonton's JavaScript meetup. Thanks to our sponsors, Jobber and Investopedia. Support the meetup and like and share this video, and stay informed by following us on Twitter and meetup.com. Links in the description. See you soon!